I still remember the day it all started. An ordinary Tuesday morning when I found a crisp white envelope tucked under my front door. At first, I thought it was another HOA newsletter or a reminder to trim my hedges. But as I unfolded the letter, my stomach twisted into knots. Bold letters screamed at me from the page. Notice of violation. Your dog exceeds the HOA size limit. My heart pounded in my chest. Max, my golden retriever, wasn't just a pet. He was family. After my husband passed away 2 years ago, Max became my source of comfort during the loneliest nights. The idea that the HOA wanted me to get rid of him felt like a cruel joke. I sank onto the couch, rereading the letter. The HOA had decided that any dog over 40 pounds was a nuisance to the neighborhood's appearance. Max was 65 pounds of pure joy, and there was no way I was giving him up. I glanced over at him, his golden fur gleaming in the sunlight as he chewed on his favorite squeaky toy. He wagged his tail, blissfully unaware of the battle looming ahead. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. After all, I'd lived in the neighborhood for 8 years without any issues. So, I decided to call the HOA president, Mrs. Carmichael, a woman known for her iron-fisted control over the community. She picked up on the second ring. Hello? Her voice was clipped and cold. Hi, Mrs. Carmichael. This is Rachel Parker from Elmwood Drive. I received a notice about my dog, Max. I was hoping to clear this up. She cut me off. The rules are clear, Mrs. Parker. Dogs over 40 pounds are not allowed under our revised guidelines. You have 30 days to rehome the animal or face a $100 per day fine. My grip on the phone tightened. But Max isn't hurting anyone. He's well behaved, and he's been here for years without a problem. Can we discuss this? I don't make exceptions, she snapped. The rules apply to everyone. Good day. The line went dead. I sat there for a moment, stunned. Anger bubbled inside me, but I knew arguing with Mrs. Carmichael was pointless. I needed another plan, one that would protect Max and keep us together. The next day, I started researching. I pored over the HOA bylaws and local statutes, determined to find a loophole. Hours turned into days, and soon my dining room table was covered in legal documents and post-it notes. What struck me the most was how arbitrary the dog size rule was. It wasn't based on behavior or noise, just an outdated belief that bigger dogs were a problem. Then I found something interesting. According to our state's housing laws, any pet that provides emotional support cannot be restricted by HOA rules. My heart raced with hope. Max wasn't just a pet. He was my emotional lifeline. If I could prove his value to my mental health, the HOA couldn't force me to give him up. I scheduled an appointment with my therapist, Dr. Bennett. She'd been helping me cope with my husband's passing and knew how much Max meant to me. After a long conversation, she agreed to write a letter confirming that Max provided essential emotional support. Armed with the letter, I drafted a formal response to the HOA. I outlined the state law, attached my therapist's letter, and demanded they revoke the violation. I hand-delivered the letter to the HOA office, feeling a surge of confidence as I slid it through the mail slot. Days passed without a response. Just when I thought I had won, another letter arrived. Request denied. The HOA does not recognize emotional support animals under community regulations. I couldn't believe it. Not only were they ignoring the law, they were doubling down. It felt personal now. Mrs. Carmichael wanted to make an example out of me, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. If the HOA wanted a fight, I was ready to give them one. I wasn't the type to back down from a fight, especially not when it came to family. And to me, Max was family. The HOA might have thought their denial would make me give up, but they underestimated just how far I was willing to go. I knew I had to be smart. Charging into another argument with Mrs. Carmichael wouldn't work. She thrived on power, and I had no intention of giving her the satisfaction. Instead, I decided to go above her head. I spent the next few days researching state and federal laws about housing rights. What I found only strengthened my resolve. Under the Fair Housing Act, homeowners associations could not discriminate against people who needed emotional support animals. Their bylaws didn't override federal law. And Mrs. Carmichael? She was in direct violation. But knowing the law wasn't enough, I needed to make my case unshakable. I reached out to my neighbor, Mr. Whitaker, a retired attorney who'd always had a soft spot for Max. He was the type who believed in fairness, and when I explained my situation, his face darkened with disapproval. "They're crossing a line," he said, shaking his head. "HOAs think they're untouchable until someone forces them to follow the law. And luckily for you, I still know a thing or two about that." Within a day, Mr. Whitaker had drafted a formal legal notice addressed to the HOA board. It wasn't just a simple letter. It was a clear warning that their refusal to acknowledge my emotional support animal violated federal law. If they didn't withdraw the violation immediately, we would take legal action. I delivered the letter myself, making sure to hand it directly to Mrs. Carmichael. When she opened the door, she gave me a cold smile, but her expression faltered when she saw the letter's heading. Legal Notice, Fair Housing Act Violation. "What's this?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "Consider it a reminder that your rules don't outweigh federal law," I said calmly. "You have 7 days to drop the violation, or I'll see you in court." I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned on my heel and walked away, heart pounding, but head held high. I knew I was on the right side of the law, and soon so would she. The next few days were tense. Every time I walked Max around the neighborhood, I felt the HOA's watchful eyes on me. I overheard whispers from other residents, some sympathetic, others not. Mrs. Carmichael, as expected, didn't back down immediately. Instead, she started a campaign against me. First came the fines. Every morning, a new letter arrived claiming I owed $100 for every day Max remained in my home. The total climbed higher and higher, as if they thought I would break under the pressure. What they didn't know was, I had anticipated this. I documented everything. Every fine, every letter, and every interaction with Mrs. Carmichael. I even started recording my conversations with her. If this escalated to court, I wanted an airtight case. Then, things turned ugly. One night, I found a bright yellow notice taped to my door. Final warning: failure to comply will result in legal action. I ripped the paper down, rage burning through me. They were threatening to take me to court, but the irony wasn't lost on me. I was already preparing to do the same. But that wasn't the worst of it. 2 days later, Max and I returned from a walk to find my back gate open. My heart dropped. Max always stayed close, but the thought of someone tampering with my property left me shaken. Thankfully, he was safe, wagging his tail by my side. But the message was clear. Someone wanted me to know they were watching. I refused to be intimidated. Instead, I doubled down on my efforts. I reached out to local news outlets. If the HOA wanted a war, I would fight them on every front. I shared my story with a journalist who was all too eager to expose the abuse of power by HOAs. Within a week, an article appeared. Homeowner fights HOA over beloved support animal. Is the board breaking federal law? The article spread like wildfire. Neighbors I had never spoken to before started reaching out, sharing their own horror stories about Mrs. Carmichael's tyrannical reign. I realized then I wasn't the only one who had been bullied. I had simply been the first to fight back. The pressure was building, but Mrs. Carmichael wasn't done yet. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I opened it, expecting another fine, but instead I found something far more serious. The HOA board has scheduled a special meeting to discuss your continued non-compliance. Attendance is mandatory. I knew what they were trying to do. This wasn't just about Max. They wanted to humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood and make an example out of me. But what they didn't realize was I wasn't coming to that meeting unprepared. I had one more card to play, and when the day of the meeting arrived, I was going to use it. The day of the HOA meeting arrived with an air of tension hanging over the neighborhood. I could feel the weight of every glance as I walked Max one last time before heading to the clubhouse. Whispers followed me, but I kept my head high. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up to the people who thought they could push anyone around. I arrived early. The room was already half filled with residents, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. At the front of the room, Mrs. Carmichael sat behind a long table with the rest of the HOA board. Her lips curled into a satisfied smirk when she saw me enter. She thought she'd already won. I took a seat near the front, keeping my folder of documents close. I wasn't about to let their intimidation work on me. At precisely 7 p.m., Mrs. Carmichael stood and called the meeting to order. Her voice was sharp and authoritative, but I could sense the slightest tremor underneath. She knew this wasn't just another petty fine. If she lost, it could unravel her entire grip on the neighborhood. "We are here," she began, her tone clipped, "to address a clear violation of HOA bylaws. Ms. Taylor has refused to comply with our pet size regulations and continues to harbor a dog that exceeds the approved limit." I raised my hand immediately. "He's not just a dog," I said firmly. "Max is an emotional support animal, protected under the Fair Housing Act." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I could see Mr. Whitaker sitting toward the back, giving me a reassuring nod. I wasn't alone in this. Mrs. Carmichael's smile tightened. "Miss Taylor, our bylaws are very clear." "And federal law is clearer," I interrupted. I stood up, holding the legal notice Mr. Whitaker had prepared. "The Fair Housing Act requires you to make reasonable accommodations for emotional support animals. Your bylaw doesn't override federal protections, no matter how much power you think you have." The room went still. For the first time, Mrs. Carmichael's confidence wavered. She shuffled the papers in front of her, searching for a response, but I wasn't done. "I've documented every fine, every warning, every attempt to intimidate me," I continued. "If you push forward with legal action, you'll be violating my rights. And trust me, the courts don't take kindly to that." I glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of my neighbors. "How many others have you bullied into silence? How many people have paid fines just to avoid your harassment?" A few people shifted in their seats, and I caught sight of a woman in the second row nodding quietly. "You can try to paint me as a rule breaker, but the truth is, I know my rights," I said, letting my voice ring clear. "And if you don't drop the violation immediately, I'm prepared to take this case as far as it needs to go." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The power Mrs. Carmichael had wielded for years was slipping, and she knew it. Then Mr. Whitaker stood up. "I'm a retired attorney," he announced, his voice carrying easily. "And I can confirm everything Ms. Taylor has said is accurate. The HOA cannot enforce a bylaw that violates federal law. If this goes to court, you will lose." Gasps filled the room. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, and even Mrs. Carmichael's face paled slightly. Still, she tried to maintain her composure. "We'll take your concerns under advisement," she said through gritted teeth. "The board will deliberate and provide a written response within 30 days. I wasn't about to let her drag this out. "Actually," I said, pulling another document from my folder, "you'll provide a response within 7 days. Or I'll file a formal complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And if I have to do that, I'll also seek damages for emotional distress and legal fees." The room erupted in hushed whispers again. For the first time, Mrs. Carmichael had no comeback. She knew she was trapped. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair, leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Her jaw tightened, but she gave a short, reluctant nod. "We'll drop the violation," she said stiffly, barely able to get the words out. A wave of relief washed over me, but I didn't let it show. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a message to everyone in the room. They didn't have to live in fear of an overreaching HOA. I gathered my documents and turned to leave, but as I passed by Mrs. Carmichael's table, I paused. "Next time," I said quietly, "maybe you should read the law before you try to enforce it." I walked out with my head high and Max's leash in hand, knowing one thing for sure: no one was going to take my dog away from me. The days following the HOA meeting were strangely quiet. For the first time in months, no threatening letters appeared in my mailbox. No board members patrolled my property under the guise of routine inspections. Even Mrs. Carmichael seemed to retreat into the shadows, her usual condescending glares absent when I walked Max through the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was over, that my speech and legal threat had scared them into submission. But deep down, I knew Mrs. Carmichael wasn't the type to back down quietly. She had ruled this neighborhood for over a decade, and people like her didn't let go of power without a fight. I was right. One morning, about a week after the meeting, I received an official-looking letter from the HOA. I opened it, half expecting another bogus violation. But what I read made my blood boil. Notice of special hearing. The HOA board has voted to amend the pet policy, specifically to exclude emotional support animals over 25 pounds. You are required to attend this hearing to discuss the future of your property compliance. I clenched the letter in my fist. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. They couldn't win legally, so they were trying to change the rules beneath my feet. And if they succeeded, they wouldn't just force Max out. They'd make an example of me to scare the rest of the neighborhood into silence. I wasn't going to let that happen. I reached for my phone and dialed Mr. Whitaker. The line clicked after 2 rings. "I figured you'd call," he said, his voice steady. "They're more predictable than they think." "They're trying to rewrite the rules," I said, pacing my living room. "Can they actually do this?" He sighed. "Technically, yes, if they follow the proper procedures. But even then, they can't override federal protections. This is their attempt to intimidate you again." I exhaled sharply. "So what do I do now?" "You fight back," he said simply. "If they want to play dirty, we'll make sure they regret it." Over the next week, Mr. Whitaker and I prepared for the special hearing. I gathered every piece of documentation I could. Letters from my doctor confirming Max's role as an emotional support animal, records of the fines I'd already paid, and statements from other homeowners who had quietly faced similar bullying. Word spread fast in the neighborhood. A few neighbors I barely knew began stopping me during my walks. Some offered quiet encouragement. Others shared their own stories of harassment from the HOA. Mrs. Carmichael's grip wasn't as unshakable as she thought. By the time the hearing arrived, I wasn't just defending Max. I was standing up for everyone they had silenced. The clubhouse was packed when I arrived. More residents had shown up than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting. Even people who usually avoided the board's politics came to see the showdown. I took my seat near the front, my hands steady despite the anger simmering inside me. Mrs. Carmichael sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other board members. But something in her face had changed. There was a flicker of uncertainty beneath her usual smugness. The meeting began with the usual formalities before Mrs. Carmichael cleared her throat. "We are here to discuss the proposed amendment to our pet policy," she announced, her voice louder than necessary. "This amendment will bring our regulations in line with community standards and ensure the safety and appearance of our neighborhood." I stood up immediately. "You mean this amendment is a direct attack on me and my emotional support animal?" I said clearly, my voice carrying across the room. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Mrs. Carmichael's eyes narrowed. "Miss Taylor, this isn't personal." "It's absolutely personal," I cut in. "You lost your attempt to enforce an illegal bylaw, and now you're trying to rewrite the rules to punish me for standing up to you." I lifted a thick folder and placed it on the table with a heavy thud. "This is everything I've documented. Every fine, every letter, and every attempt to intimidate me. You're not enforcing the rules. You're abusing your power." Several people in the crowd nodded. A man near the back called out, "She's right. We're tired of this nonsense." Mrs. Carmichael's face flushed red, but I wasn't done. "And by the way," I continued, holding up a printed email from the State Housing Authority, "I spoke with legal counsel. If you pass this amendment and attempt to enforce it, I will file a federal complaint for discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. That could mean thousands of dollars in legal fees and personal liability for every board member who votes in favor of this." The room fell into stunned silence. For once, Mrs. Carmichael had nothing to say. Her carefully controlled facade cracked as the weight of my words and the potential consequences sank in. One of the other board members, a quiet man who had barely spoken during the meeting, cleared his throat. I don't think we should proceed with this amendment," he said hesitantly. Another member nodded quickly. "This could get out of hand legally. I'm not risking a federal investigation." Mrs. Carmichael opened her mouth to argue, but the tide had turned against her. Even her allies on the board weren't willing to follow her down this road. With a reluctant sigh, the oldest board member motioned to end the discussion. "I move to strike the amendment from consideration," he said. A shaky second followed, and when the vote was called, the motion passed overwhelmingly. It was over. I felt a rush of relief as the meeting adjourned. Max wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I. As the crowd began to disperse, I caught Mrs. Carmichael's furious glare. She wasn't used to losing, and I knew this wouldn't be the last time she tried to assert her authority. But from now on, she would think twice before coming after me. And as I walked out of the clubhouse, Max by my side, I knew one thing for sure. No one was above the law, not even the HOA. Life settled into a new rhythm after the special hearing. With the amendment officially struck down, the HOA backed off for a while. No more violation letters arrived in my mailbox, and no one dared to mention Max's size again. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. Max seemed to sense the change too. Our morning walks through the neighborhood became more peaceful. Instead of hurried glances over my shoulder, I could finally enjoy the fresh air. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to chat, offering quiet words of support. It was as if standing up to the HOA had given others permission to voice their frustrations. But I wasn't naive. I knew Mrs. Carmichael wasn't finished with me. Her pride wouldn't allow her to let this go quietly. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood with an iron fist. She wouldn't accept defeat easily. And I was right. It started subtly. First, my lawn was reported for being overgrown, despite the grass being freshly mowed. Then, a letter arrived accusing me of excessive noise, even though Max and I lived a quiet life. Every few days, a new violation appeared, each more ridiculous than the last. I documented everything, every letter, every so-called inspection, every time a board member slowed their car in front of my house. Mr. Whitaker advised me to stay calm and collect evidence. If they tried to retaliate legally, we'd be ready. One afternoon, I returned home to find a bright red sign staked into my front yard. Notice of non-compliance, fines pending. I tore the sign out of the ground, my hands shaking with anger. I knew exactly who was behind this. Without hesitation, I marched to the HOA office, Max trotting loyally beside me. Mrs. Carmichael was sitting behind her desk when I arrived. She barely glanced up as I slammed the red sign onto her desk. "This is harassment," I said, my voice low but steady. Her lips curled into a thin smile. "We're simply enforcing community standards." I took a deep breath, refusing to let her bait me. "You're abusing your position, and you know it. I followed every rule to the letter, but that isn't enough for you, is it?" She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly. "You think you've won, Miss Taylor, but this neighborhood has standards, and I will ensure they're maintained." Her calmness only fueled my anger. It was clear. She wouldn't stop until she drove me out. That night, as I sat on my porch with Max curled at my feet, I realized I had a choice. I could continue reacting to her petty tactics, or I could take control of the situation once and for all. I chose the latter. The next morning, I made a call to a local investigative journalist. I had read their articles about HOA abuses in nearby neighborhoods, and I knew this story was right up their alley. When I explained the situation, how the HOA was targeting an emotional support animal and retaliating against homeowners, the journalist was immediately interested. Within days, they arrived at my home with a camera crew. I walked them through everything: the illegal fines, the attempt to rewrite bylaws, and the endless harassment. Max, as always, stayed by my side, his calm presence a reminder of why I was fighting. The journalist didn't stop with my story. They knocked on doors across the neighborhood, uncovering more stories of abuse. Elderly homeowners fined for minor lawn decorations. Families penalized for harmless play equipment. The more they dug, the clearer the picture became. Mrs. Carmichael wasn't protecting the community. She was using her power to control and punish. When the expose aired on local television, the fallout was immediate. Neighbors who had stayed silent out of fear began speaking up. Complaints flooded the city's housing authority. Even the local council took notice, launching an official review of the HOA's actions. And Mrs. Carmichael? Her smug facade finally cracked. At the next HOA meeting, the tension in the air was palpable. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. Residents who had never attended a meeting before showed up, eager to have their voices heard. I took my seat in the front row, heart pounding, but head held high. I wasn't the same scared homeowner I had been months ago. I had faced her bullying and refused to back down. Mrs. Carmichael tried to maintain her usual authority, but the tide had turned. The room buzzed with anger and frustration as one homeowner after another shared their grievances. By the end of the night, the board had no choice but to act. Under immense pressure, they called a vote of no confidence. When the results were tallied, it was unanimous. Mrs. Carmichael was removed from her position as HOA president. I expected her to argue, to lash out, but she said nothing. Her face pale, she gathered her papers and left the clubhouse without a word. It was over. I walked home that night with Max by my side, a deep sense of relief washing over me. The battle had been long and exhausting, but I had won, not just for myself, but for the entire neighborhood. More importantly, I had proven something to myself. I wasn't someone who could be pushed around. Max would always have a home with me, and no HOA, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could ever take that away. The days following Mrs. Carmichael's removal felt surreal. For months, I had lived under the shadow of her control. Each letter, each threat, each humiliation weighing on me. Now the weight was gone. The new HOA board, led by a fair-minded neighbor named Mr. Castillo, immediately rolled back the unfair fines. He personally delivered a letter to my door, formally apologizing for the harassment I had endured. The No Large Dogs Amendment was not only repealed, but replaced with a new bylaw, ensuring no emotional support or service animal could ever be targeted again. Max was safe, and so was every other pet in the neighborhood. One afternoon, as I watered the garden, Mr. Whitaker strolled over, a wide smile on his face. "You did it," he said, tipping his hat. "I couldn't have done it without your help," I admitted. He chuckled softly. "You stood up when it mattered most. Not everyone has that kind of courage." The truth was, I hadn't felt courageous at first. There were nights I questioned if it was worth the fight. But every time I thought about giving up, Max would nudge my hand or rest his head on my knee, reminding me why I had started this battle. And I knew it was worth every step. The news report on our HOA's corruption gained traction beyond our small town. It sparked conversations about HOA overreach across the state. In the weeks following Mrs. Carmichael's removal, local politicians began drafting new laws limiting the powers of HOAs and strengthening the rights of homeowners. One of those laws, it became known as Max's Law, a statute protecting emotional support animals from arbitrary HOA restrictions. Seeing Max's name attached to real change was a feeling I could never describe. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came a month later. I was sitting on the porch, sipping my evening tea, when a familiar black sedan pulled up. I recognized it immediately. It was Mrs. Carmichael's. Only this time, her usual arrogance was gone. She stepped out, clutching a stack of papers, and marched toward my driveway. I stayed seated, watching as she hesitated at the foot of my porch. For a long moment she said nothing, just stood there, lips pursed, eyes filled with unspoken bitterness. Finally, she thrust the papers toward me. "I'm moving," she said curtly. I took the papers from her hands. It was a property transfer notice. Mrs. Carmichael was selling her house. "Good luck," I said, my voice steady. She didn't respond. With one last scowl, she turned on her heel and disappeared into her car. Moments later, the engine roared to life and she drove away, out of my neighborhood and hopefully out of my life forever. I exhaled deeply, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Max padded up beside me, resting his head on my knee as if to say, "We did it." "Looks like we won, buddy," I murmured, scratching his ears. And we had. The battle against the HOA had tested me in ways I never imagined. But through every obstacle, every sleepless night, and every confrontation, I had refused to back down. Not for myself, not for Max, and not for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. From that day forward, our neighborhood changed. The new HOA board focused on fairness instead of control. Neighbors who once felt powerless found their voices. And Max? He became something of a local legend. The dog who took down the HOA president. And me? I finally felt at peace. No more letters, no more threats. Just quiet evenings on the porch with my best friend. Exactly how life was meant to be. And nothing, not an HOA, not a power-hungry president, could ever take that from us again.